The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. In the bosom of one of the spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at that broad expanse of the river dominated by the ancient Dutch navigators the Tappan Zee, and where they always prudently shortened their sails and implored the protection of St. Nicholas when they crossed, there lies a small market town or rural port, which by some is called Greensboro, but which is more generally and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. This name was given, we are told, in former days by the good housewives of the adjacent country, from the propensity of their husbands to linger about the village on market days. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for that fact, but merely advert for it, for the sake of being precise and authentic. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there's a little valley, or rather lap of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, which just murmurs enough to lull one to repose. The tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks upon the tranquillity. I recollect that when a strapling, my first exploit in squirrel shooting was in the grove of tall walnut trees that shade one side of the valley. I had wandered into it at noontime, when all of nature is particularly quiet, and was startled by the roar of my own gun as it broke the Sabbath silence around. It was prolonged and reverberated by the ancient echoes of the hills. If I ever should wish for a retreat where I might steal from the world and its distractions and dream quietly away at the remnant of its troubled life, I know of none other more pleasing than this little valley. From the listless repose of the place and the particular character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, the sequestered glen has long been known by the name Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout the neighboring county. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and pervade the very atmosphere. Some say this place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others, that an old Indian chief or prophet or wizard of his tribe held powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain as it is, the place still continues to sway under some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continuing revere. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, and are subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, twilight superstitions, shooting stars, meteor glares, with the whole ninefold. It seems to make a favorite scene of her gambols. The dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region and seems to be common chief of all the powers of the air in the apparition is the figure of a horseback on horseback without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and who is ever and anon seeking the country for his head. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. Indeed, certain of the most authentic historians of the parts, who have carefully in collecting and collaborating the floating facts concerning the spectre, allege that the body of this trooper, having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of this battle in a nightly quest for its head, and then in the rushing speed for which it sometimes passes along the hollow, like a midnight blast, is owing to its own behest and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Such is the general purport of this legendary superstition, which has furnished materials for many a wild story in the region of shadows, and of the spectre is known at the country's firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. It is remarkable that a visionary propensity I have mentioned is not confined to the native residents of this village, but is unconsciously imbibed by everyone who resides there for a time. However wide awake they may have been before they entered the sleepy region, they are in a time to inhale the witching influence of the air, and to begin to grow in imagination, to dream dreams and see apparitions. I mention this peaceful spot with all its possible laud, for it is such a little retired Dutch valleys found here and there embosomed in the great state of New York, that population, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration and improvement, which is making such incessant changes in other parts of this restless country, sweeps by them unobserved. They are like those little nooks of still water which border a rapid stream, where we may see the straw in the bubble riding quietly on anchor, or slowly revolving in their mimic harbor, undisturbed by the rush of the passing current. Though many years have elapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, yet I have questioned whether I should not still find the same trees, the same families, in their sheltered bosom. In this bypass of nature, there abode, in a remote period of American history, that is to say, some 30 years hence, a worthy wait of the name of Ichabod Crane, or as it expressed, tarried in Sleepy Hollow, for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was a native of Connecticut, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for its mine as well as for its forest, and sends forth yearly its legions of frontier woodsmen and country schoolmasters. The cognomen of Cain was not that inadaptable to his person. He was tall, but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeve, feet that might have served as shovels, and the whole frame loosely hung together. His head was small, flat at top, with huge ears, large, green, glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon a spindly neck, to tell which way the wind blew. To see him striding along at the profile of a hill on a rainy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering around him, one might have mistaken him for the genus of famine descending upon the earth, or some scarecrow eloped from its cornfield. His schoolhouse was a low biting of one large room, rudely constructed of logs and windows partly glazed. They were partly patched by leaves of old copybooks, which is most ingeniously secured at the vacant hours, and a twisting of the handle of the door that stakes against the window shutters, so that, though a thief might get in with perfect ease, he would find some embarrassment getting out, an idea most probably borrowed by the architect Jos van Houten from the mastery of the Eopot. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation, just at the foot of the woody hill, with a brook running close by, and a formidable birch tree growing at one end. From hence the low murmur of his pupils' voices coming over their lessons might be heard in a drory summer's day, like the hum of a beehive, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the master, and the tone of the menace of command, by the appalling sound of the birch as he urged some toddler loiterer along the flowery path of knowledge. Truth be said, he was a conscientious man, and ever bore in mind the golden maxim, spare the rod and spoil the child. Ichabod's scholars certainly were not spoiled. I would have not imagined it, however, that he was one of those cruel schoolmasters that take joy in the smart of their subjects. On the contrary, He administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, taking the burden off the backs of the weak and laying it onto those of the strong. Your mere puny strapling that winced at the least flourish of the rod was passed by with indulgence, but the claims of justice were satisfied by inflicting a double portion on some little tough, wrong-haired, broad-skirted Dutch urchin, who slurped and swelled and grew dodged from the southern beneath of the birch. And all this he called doing his duty by the parents. And he never inflicted a chastisement that by its insurance so smarting the urchin that he would not remember it, and would thank him in the longest day he would ever live. When school hours were over, he was even the champion of the playmate of the larger boys, and on holiday afternoons would convey some of the smaller ones home, who happened to have pretty sisters, or good housewives or mothers, noted for the comforts of their cupboard. Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils. The revenue arising from his school was small, and he would have scarcely sufficient funds to furnish himself with daily bread, for he was a huge feeder, and though lank, had the dilating powers of an anaconda. But to help out his maintenance, he was, according to the county customs in the parts, boarded and lodged at the houses of the farmers whose children he instructed. With these he lived successfully a week at a time, thus going around in the neighborhood with all his worldly effects tied in a cotton handkerchief. This might all not be too erroneous on the purses of his rustic patrons, who are the adapt costs of the school for a grievous burden, and schoolmasters as drones. He had various ways of rendering himself both useful and agreeable. He assisted the farmers occasionally in the lighter labors of the farms, helped to make hay, mended the fences, took the horses to water, drove the cows from pasture, and cut wood for the winter fire. He laid aside, too, all dominant dignity and absolute sway in which he lorded over his little empire. He became wonderfully gentle and ingratiating. He found favor in the eyes of the mothers for petting the children, particularly the youngest. And like the lion brood, which magnanimously the lamb did not hold, he would sit with the child on one knee and rock the cradle with his foot for hours at a time. In addition to his other vocations, he was the singing master for the neighborhood, and picked up many a bright sibling by instructing the young folks in psalmody. It was a matter of no little vanity to him on Sundays to take his station in front of the church gallery with a hand of chosen singers, where in his own mind he completely carried the palm from his parson. Certain as it is, his voice resounded far above the rest of the congregation, and there are particular quavers still to be heard in that church, at which may even be heard half a mile off, quite the opposite side of the mill pond on a still Sunday morning, which are said to be legitimately descended from the nose of Ichabod Crane. Thus, by diverse little makeshifts in the ingenious way which is commonly dominated by hook or by crook, the worthy pedagogue got on tolerably enough, and was thought of by all who understood nothing of labor as having a wonderful easy life. The schoolmaster is generally a man of some importance in the female circle of the rural neighborhood, being considered a kind of gentle personage of vastly superior tastes and accomplishments to the rough, ready country swines, and instead inferior in learning only to his parsons. His appearance, therefore, is apt to occasion a little stir at the tea of the farmhouse, and then the addition of the supernumerary dishes of cakes and sweetmeats, or proventure, the pride of the silver teapot. Our man of letters, therefore, was particularly happy in the smiles of all the country damsels. He would figure among them in the churchyard between services on Sundays, gathering grapes for them from the wild vines that overlooked the surrounding trees, reciting for their amusement the epitaphs on tombstones, sauntering with a whole bereavement of them, along the breaks of the ancient millpond, where the more bashful country bumpkins hung sheepishly back, conveying his superior elegance and address. From his half itinerant life, also, he was kind of traveling gazette, carrying the whole budget of the local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was moreover esteemed by the women as a man of great education, for he had read several books quite thoroughly, and had perfect mastery of Cotton Mather's The History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, he was almost firmly a potent believer. He was, in fact, an odd mixture of small shrewdness and simple cruelty. His appetite for the marvelous and his powers of digesting it were equally extraordinary, and he had increased by his residency in the spellbound region. No tale was too gross or monstrous for his capacious swallow. It was often his delight, after his school was dismissed in the afternoon, to stretch himself on the rich bank of the Clover, bordering the little bank that whimpered by his schoolhouse, and there con over old Mather's tales till the gathering of dusk of the evening made it impossible for the printed page to be read. Then, as he winded his way back by swamp and stream and an awful woodland to the farmhouse where he happened to be quartered, every sound of nature at that witching hour flustered his excited imagination. The moan of a whippoorwill from the hillside, the brooding cry of a tree frog, the harbinger of a storm, the dreary hooting of a screech owl, or the sudden rustling in the thicket of birds flighting from the roost. The fireflies, too, which sparked almost vividly in the darkest places now and then, startled him, as one uncommon to brightness would startle across his path. As if by chance a huge blockhead of a beetle came blundering his way, the poor vet was ready to give up the ghost, and with that idea he was struck with the witch's token. His only resource on such occasions was to drown the thought or drive away the evil spirits, was to sing psalm tunes. And the good people of Sleepy Hollow, as they sat in their doors in the evening, would often feel awe at hearing his melody, in Lincoln sweetness, a long drowned out, floating from the distance of the hills. Another of his sources of fierce pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives as they spun by the fire. The row of apples roasting and sputtering along the hearth, they listened to the marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins and haunted fields and haunted brooks and the haunted bridge and the haunted house, and especially of the Headless Horseman, or the Hessian of the Hollow, as sometimes they talked to him. He would delight them equally with his anecdotes of witchcraft and of the dire omens and portent sights and sounds of the area. But if there was pleasure in it at all, while snugly cuddling in his chimney corner of the chamber, that was all the ruddy glow of the cackling wood and the fire, it was nearly purchased by the terrors of the subsequent walk home. What fearful shapes and shadows beset his path amongst the dim and the ghastly glare of the snowy night. With what wistful look did the eye, ever trembling, ray of light streaming across the wasteland of a field to some adjacent window. How often was he appalled by some shrub covered with snow, which, by the sheerest speculation of its very path, how often did he shrink and cuddle awe at the sound of his own footsteps on the frosty grass, and dread the look over his shoulder, at least he should behold some uncouth being trampling close behind him. And how often was he thrown into complete disarray by some rushing blast, howling among the trees, in the idea that it was the galloping Hessian, as on one of his nightly scowlings. All these, however, were made terrors of the night phantoms, of the mind that walk in the darkness. And though he had seen many spectres in his time, and been more than once beset by Satan in diverse shapes in his lonely predations, yet daylight put an end to all these evils, and he would have passed a pleasant life of it in despite of the devil and all his works, if his path had not been crossed by a small being that causes more perplexity to the mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the whole race of witches put together, and that was a woman. Among the musical disciples who assembled one evening in each week to recite her instructions in psalmody was Katrina Van Tessel, the daughter of the only child of the substantial Dutch farmer. She was a blooming lass, a fair, fresh 18, plump as a parridge, ripe and melting, as rosy cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and universally famed not merely for her beauty, but her vast expectations. She was withal a little bit of coquette, as might be perceived in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions, as most set off her charms. She wore the ornaments of pure yellow gold that her great great grandmother had brought with her from Sardaigne. The tempting stomacher on the old time, and withal provokingly short petticoat, to display the prettiest foot and ankle in the country abroad. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart toward the sex, and it is not to be wondered that it was so tempting a morsel soon found favor with his eyes, especially after he had visited her parental mansion. Old Baltrus Van Tessel was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer. He seldom, it is true, sent either his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his own farm, but within everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, but not proud of it. He piqued himself among the hearty abundance, rather than the style in which he lived. His stronghold was situated on the banks of the Hudson, in one of those green, sheltered, fertile nooks in which the Dutch farmers are so proud of nesting. The great elm tree spread its broad branches over it, and at the foot of which bubbled up a spring, in the softest and sweetest water, in a little well formed of a barrel, and then stole sparkling away through the grass to a neighboring brook that bubbled along antlers and dwarf willows. Hard by the farmhouse was a vast barn that might have served as a church. Every window and crevice seemed to be bursting forth with the treasures of the farm. The frail was busily resounding within the morning to night. Swallows and martins skipped twitting about the eaves, and the rows of the pigeons, some turned one eye up as if watching the other, some turning their heads under their wings and burrowed into their bosoms, and others swelling and cooing, and bowed about their dames, which enjoyed sunshine on the floor. A stately squadron of snow geese were riding in an adjoining pond, convoying huge fleets of ducks. Regiments of turkeys were gobbling throughout the farmstead, and guinea fowl were fussing about, like ill-tempered housewives, which their peevish, discontented cry. Before the barn door situated the giant cock, and his pattern of his husband, a warrior and a fine gentleman, clapping his bosom wings and crowing in the pride and the gladness, sometimes tearing up the earth with his feet, and then generously calling over his every hungry family of wife and children to enjoy the rich morsel he had discovered. The stream's mouth watered as he looked among his scrumptious promise of luxuries, winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured himself, every roasting pig running with the pudding in his belly and an apple in his mouth. The pigeons were snugly put to bed in a comfortable pie, and tucked in with a cuvee of crust. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks paired nicely in dishes, like snug married couples, with decent compensatory of onion sauce. In the pokers, he saw a carved out future sleek side of bacon and juicy ham. Not a turkey, but he beheld the gizzard under its wing and a necklace of savory sausages. And even bright Kinkasar himself lay swallowing in his back, in a side dish with uplifted claws, as if craving the quarter which is chivalrously spirited detained to ask while living. When he entered the house of the conquest of his heart was complete, it was one of those spacious farmhouses with high ridged but low sloping roofs, built in the style of the first Dutch settlers, the low projecting eaves forming a plaza under the front, capable of closing up in bad weather. From the moment Ichabod had laid eyes upon this region of delight, the peace of his mind was at an end, and the only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tessel. In this enterprise, however, he had more difficulty generally fell in the lot of the knight errant of yore, who succumb had any but giants and enchanters, fiery dragons, of which would easily conquer adversaries to contend with. And it had to make his way past not merely through the gates of iron and the walls and the castle keep. Ichabod, on the contrary, had to beset himself with a labyrinth of whims which were forever presenting new difficulties and impediments. He had to encounter a host of fearful adversaries of real flesh and blood, the numerous rustic admirers ready to fly out of the common cause against new competitors. Among the most formidable was a burly, roaring, roisterous blade by the name of Abraham, or, according to the Dutch, Brom van Brant, the hero of the country road, which rang of his feats of strength and handiwork. He was a broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short curly black hair, and a buff but not unpleasant countenance. From his Herculean frame and great powers of limb, he had received the nickname of Brom Bones, from which he was universally known. He was famed for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, and as dexterous on a horseback as a Tartar. He has foremost all the races and cockfights, and, with the assistance of bold strength acquired in rustic life, was the umpire in all disputes, settling his hat to one side and giving his decisions with an air of tone, admitting of no gamely or appeal. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but had more mischief than ill will in his composure. He had 3 or 4 boon companions who guarded him as their model, and the head of whom he scoured the country, attending every scene or feud or merriment for miles around. In cold weather, he was distinguished by a fur cap surmounted by a flaunting foxtail, and when the folks of the county gathered this well-known crest at a distance, whisking, ouch, they would say, "Aye, there goes Brom Bones and his gang." The neighbors looked upon him as a mixture of awe and aberration and goodwill, and when any madcap prank or rusty brawl occurred in the vicinity, they always shook their heads and warranted Brom Bones was the bottom of it. This rapid-hole hero had some time singled out the blooming Katina for the object of his uncouth gallantries, and though his amorous toyings were something like a gentler caress and endearment of a bear, yet it was whispered that he could not alone discourage his hopes. Certain as it is, his advances were signals for rival candidates to retire, who felt no inclination to cross a lion in his amorous insomuch. Such was the formidable foe with which Ichabod had to contend, and considering all things, a stouter man would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser man would have despaired. He had, however, a happy mixture of plenitude and perseverance. in his nature, and he was from the spirit of a supple yet uh, tough through his bent. He never broke, and though he bowed beneath the slightest pressure, he always got away. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness, for he was not a man to be thwarted in his admirers, any more than a stormy lover Achilles. Ichabod therefore made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under the cover of his uh, post as singing master, he made frequent visits to the farmhouse. Not that he had anything to apprehend the meddlesome interference of the parents, which is an open stumbling block in the path of most lovers. Walt Van Tressel was an easy, indulgent soul. He loved his daughters better than even his pipe, and like the reasonable man and an excellent father, let her have her way with everything. His notable little wife, too, soon enough had to attend her housekeeping and manage her poultry. For so as she sagely observed, ducks and geese are foolish things, and must be looked after. The girls can take care of themselves. Thus, while the busy dame bustled about the house or piled her spinning wheel, Walt would sit smoking his evening pipe in the plaza. A little wooden warrior who, armed with a wood and sword in each hand, was most valiantly fighting the wind in the pinnacle of the barn. Ichabod would carry on his suit with the daughter by the side of the spring under the great elm, or sauntering across in the twilight. I profess I do not know how women's hearts are wooed and won. To me, they have always been a matter of riddle and admiration. Some seem to have one but vulnerable point or door of access, which others have 1,000. It is a great triumph of skill to gain the former, but still a greater proof of generalship to maintain the possession of the latter. He who wins 1,000 common hearts is therefore entitled to some renown, but he who keeps undisputed sway over the heart of a coquette is indeed a hero. Certainly it is that this was not the case with the redoubtable Brom Bones. From the moment Ichabod made his advances in the interests of the former, evidently declined, and his horse was no longer seen tied at the palings. Brom, who had a degree of rough chivalry in his nature, would fain from have carried measures to open warfare, and have settled their pretensions to the lady according to the mode of which most would conceive, the knights of yore, by single combat. But Ichabod was too conscious for the superior might of his adversary to enter in the likes against him. In this way matters went on for some time, without producing any natural effect or the relative situation of the continuing powers. On a fine autumnal afternoon, Ichabod, in his passive mood, sat enthralled on the lofty stool from which he usually watched his concerns of his little literary realm. In his hand he swayed a fuel, that a scepter and a deceptive power, the birch of justice, responded on 3 nails, behind the throne, a constant terror to the evildoers. All now was bustle and hubbub in the late great schoolroom. The scholars were hurried through their lessons without stopping at trifles, for those who stumble over half with impunity, and those who tardy had a smart application now and then in the rear to quicken their speed, to help them over a tall word. Books were flung aside without being put away in the shelves, inkstands were overturned, benches drowned, and the whole school was turned into loose horror before the usual time. The gallant Ichabod now spent at least an extra half hour at his toilet, brushing and finishing up his best, and indeed only, suit of rustic black, and arranging his locks by a bill of broken glass that he had hung up in the schoolhouse. Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought to his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle. His sharp knees struck out like grasshoppers, and he carried his whip precariously in his hand, like a scepter. When his horse jogged on, the motion in his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. A small wool hat rested on the top of his nose, and so his scanty strip of forehead might be called. The skirts of a black fluttered out almost to his tail. Such was the appearance of Ichabod and his steed as they shambled along out of the gate of Hans van Ripper. And it was altogether such an apparition as is seldom to be met in broad daylight. It was, as I have said, a fine autumnal day. The sky was clear and serene, and the nature wore the wrist of the golden ivory which had always accustomed the idea of abundance. The forests had put on their sober brown and yellow, while some trees of the tenderer kind had been nipped at by the frost in the brilliant days of orange, purple, and scarlet. Streaming files of the wild ducks began to make their appearance high in the air, and the bark of the squirrel might be heard in the groves of the beech. As Ichabod slowly jogged along his way, his eye ever open for every symptom of culinary abundance, ranged with delight over the treasures of jolly and tome. On all sides he beheld a vast store of apples, some hanging in opulence on the trees still, some gathered into buckets or barrels for the market, others heaped in rich piles on cedar presses. Farther he beheld the great fields of Indian corn, which its golden ears peppered from their leafy coverts, and their golden eyes peeping from them. Thus feeding his mind with the many sweet thoughts and sugared suppositions, he journeyed along the side of the range of hills which looked upon some of the gaudiest scenes of the mighty Hudson. The sun gradually wheeled his broad disk down into the west, and the whole blossom of Tappan Zee lay motionless and glassy. It was toward evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of Heer van Telsel, which he found thronged with the pride and valor of the adjacent country. Old farmers, a spare-leathered race in homespun counties, blue stockings, huge shoes, and magnificent powdered buckles. Their brisk, withered little dames in close crimped caps, long-waisted short gowns, homespun pennycoats, and scissors. Brombones, however, was the hero of the scene, having come to the gathering on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself full of mettle and mischief, and which no one but him could manage. It was in fact noted for preferring vicious animals, given to all kinds of tricks, for which the rider would consistently risk his neck. Fain I would pause to dwell upon the world of cosms which bursts upon the enraptured gaze of the hero, not those of the heavy and burdenous laces, with their luxurious strap of red and white and their ample charms of a genuine Dutch colony tea table, in the sumptuous times of autumn. Such heaped up platters of cakes and various and audaciously indescribable kinds, known only to the experienced Dutch housewives. There was the doughiest dough, and the tenderest opka, and crisp, crundling koller, sweet cakes and short cakes. Ichabod Crane was not such a hurry as his historian, but an ample justice every dainty, and helped himself mightily. He was a kind and thankful creature whose heart delighted in proportionate, as his skin was filled with good cheer, and those spirits rose eating, and some men do with those around them. As he ate, and chuckled with the possibility that he might one day be lord of this scene, then he thought how soon he'd turn his back upon the old schoolhouse, snap his fingers in the face of Hans von Ripper and every other patron, and kick any itinerant peerage out of their doors should they dare to call him comrade. Old Baltus von Tessel moved among his guests with a face dilated with content and good humor. Round and jolly as the harvest moon, his hospitable actions were brief but expressive. He confined to a shake of the hand, a slap on the shoulder, a loud laugh, and a pressing invitation to fall to and help themselves. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fiber about him was idle, and he have to have seen the loosely hung frame in full motion, and chattering among the rooms you would have thought St. Victus himself, the blessed patron of the dance, was figuring before you in person. He was the aberration of all who had gathered of all sexes and ages and farms from around the neighborhood, stood forming a pyramid of faces at the window, gazing with delight in the scene. How could the flogger of urchins be otherwise than animated and joyous? The lady of the heart of his partner in the dance smiled, while Brom Bones, surely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in the corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a knot of sager folks who, with old Van Tessel, sat smoking at the end of the plaza, gossiping over former times and drawing out their long stories about the war. This neighborhood, at the time of which I am speaking, was one of those highly favored places which abound in the chronicle of great men. The British and American line had run near it during the war, and therefore had some marauding and invested with refugees, cowboys, and all kinds of border chivalry. There was the story of Dolphin Monson, a large blue-bearded Dutchman who had nearly taken the British frigate with an old iron 9-pounder from a mud breastwork. There is an old gentleman who shall be nameless, being too rich a manor to be lightly mentioned, who in the Battle of the White Plains, being an excellent master of defense, parodied a musket ball with a small sword, insomuch as he absolutely felt it was past the blade and glance off the hilt, in proof of which he was ready to at any time to show the sword with the hilt a little bent. There were several more that had been acquainted with the great field, not of whom was persuaded that he had a considerable hand in bringing the war to a happy termination. But all these were nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded it. The neighborhood is rich in legendary treasures of the kind. Local tales of the superstitions thrive at the best in these sheltered long retreats, but are trampled underfoot by the shifting throng that forms the population of most of the county places. Besides, there is no encouragement for ghosts in most of our villages, for they have scarcely had time to finish their first nap and turn themselves in the grave before their surviving friends have traveled away from the neighborhood, so that once they return at night to walk upon the grounds, they have no acquaintance to call upon. This is perhaps the reason why so many seldom hear of ghosts except in our long established Dutch communities. The immediate cause, however, for the prevalence of supernatural stories in these parts was doubtless owing to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow. There was a contagion in the air that blew in from the haunted region. It breathed forth an atmosphere of dreams and fantasies, fetching all the land. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were present at Van Tassel's, and as usual were drawing out their wild and fantastic legends. Many dismal tales were told about funeral trains, mourning cries, wails heard and then seen without a presence. The chief part of the stories, however, turned to the favored specter of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, who had been heard several times of late patrolling the country, and, it was said, tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. The sequestered situation of the church seemed always to have made it a favorite haunt for troubled spirits. It stands on a knot surrounded by locust trees and lolly elms, and from which it descends whitewashed walls, shining mostly forth like Christian purity beaming through the shades of retirement. A gentle slope descends from the sliver of sheet of water, bordered by tall trees. To look upon its grass-grown yard, where the sunbeams seem to sleep so quietly, one would think there's at least one dead that might rest in peace. On one side of the church extends a holy wooden dale, along with the ravages of a large brook and broken rocks and fallen trees. This was one of the favorite haunts of the Headless Horseman, and the place where he was frequently encountered. As the tale was told, old Bauer, a heretical disbeliever in ghosts, how he met the horseman returning from his foray into Sleepy Hollow, and was obliged to get up behind him, how they galloped over bush and brake, and over the hill and swamp until they reached the bridge, when the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton, threw Browder into the brook, and sprang away over the tree with a clap of thunder. The revelry now generally broke up, and the farmers gathered together their families in their wagons, and were heard for some time rattling along the hollows of the distant hills. Some of the damsels mounted on pylons began their favorite swines, and the light-hearted laughter mingling with the chatter of hoofs echoed along the silent woods, sounding fainter and fainter until they gradually died away. What passed at this interview I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, I fear, must have gone wrong, for he certainly sallied forth and had no great interval. With an air quite chapfallen. Oh, these women, oh, these women. Could that girl have been playing off any more quartetish? It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavily hearted, crestfallen, pursued his travel home along the sides of the lofty hill that had adorned Tarrytown, and at which he traversed so cheerfully in the afternoon. The hour was dismal as himself. Far below him the Tappan Zee spread as a dusky and indistinct waste of waters, with here, at the tallest mast of the slope, riding along quietly at anchor. Now, dreadfully awakened, sound would go far, far off, and then some farmhouse would sway among the hills, but not like a dreamy sound in his ear. No signs of life occurred, but occasionally a melancholy chirrup of a cricket, or perhaps the trying of a bullfrog, from a neighboring marsh, as if sleeping uncomfortably and turning over in his bed. All stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding back in his recollections. The night grew darker and darker, and the stars seemed to sink deeper into the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching the very place from which the scenes of the ghostly stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above the other trees of the neighborhood. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for regular trees, twisting down almost to the earth as they rise again into the air, and it was connected with the tragic story of the unfortunate Andre, who had been taken prisoner hard by, and was universally known by the name Major Andrew's tree. The common people regarded it as a mixture of respect and superstition, partly out of sympathy for the fate of its ill-scarred namesake, and partly because of the tales of strange and doleful lamentations often told there. As Ichabod approached the fateful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered, but it was but a blast of sweeping wind through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but on his look more narrowly perceived that it was a place where the tree had been scalded by lightning and the white wood laid bare. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered and his knees smote against the saddle, and it was the rubbing of one huge bough through another that they were swayed by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran in the marshy and thicky wooden glen. Known by the name Wiley's Swamp, a few rough logs laid side by side served as the bridge over the stream. On that side of the road, where the brook entered the wood, a grove of oaks and chestnuts matted thick with wild grapevines. To pass the bridge was the severest trial. It was an identical spot where the unfortunate Andre was captured, and under the covert of those chestnuts and trees were the sturdy yeomen concealed who surprised him. And this has ever been considered a haunted stream, and fearful are the feelings of the schoolboy who has to pass it alone in the dark. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He summoned up, however, in his resolution, gave his horse a half score of kicks in the ribs, and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge. But instead of starting forward, the old animal made a lateral movement and ran beside against the fence. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins to the other side and kicked lustfully with the contrary foot. But it was all in vain. His steed startled, but it only was to purge to the opposite side of the road, onto which he plunged to the opposite side of the brambles and the outer bushes. The schoolmaster now bestowed both whip and heel upon the starving ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, sniffing and snorting, but came to stand just at the hedge of a suddenness that nearly sent the rider sprawling. Just at this moment, a splashy tramp by the side of the bridge caught his ear. In the dark shadows of the grove, on the magic brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen, black, and towering. It was gathering up in the gloom like some gigantic monster ready to spring forth upon the traveler. The hair of the frightened pedagogue rose on his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly was now too late, and besides, what chance of those escaping a ghost or a goblin? If it was, why would I ride in the wind? Summoning therefore enough courage, he demanded in a stammering accents, Who are you? He received no reply. He repeated his demand in still more of an agitated voice. Still there was no answer. Once more he crudgeoned the side of Gunpowder, and shutted his eyes and broke forth with an involuntary flavor into a psalm tune. Just then the shadowy object of alarm put itself into motion, and with a scramble and a bound stood once in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, yet the form had the unknown might now of some degree of a certainty. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions, mounted on a black horse of a powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who now grew even more fright with his waywardness. Ichabod, who had no relish for this strange midnight companion, and behoved himself as an adventurous Brom Bones with his galloping Hessian, now quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse in equal pace. Ichabod pulled up, fell into a walk, and then a tag behind, and the other did the same. His heart began to sink within him. He endeavored to resume his psalm tone, but his parched tongue clove to his lips and the roof of his mouth. He could not utter a stave. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of the precocious companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting the rising guard in which the figure was bright against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But the horror was still more increased by observing that the head, which should have been resting on his shoulders, was carried before him on the promontory of the saddle. His terror rose. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping at a sudden movement to give his companion the slip. Away they dashed through the thick and thin stones, flying and sparks flashing on every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long lanky body over his horse's head into the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, who seemed possessed by a demon, instead of keeping with it, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong down the hill to the left. This road leads to a shady hollow, shaded by trees for a quarter of a mile, where it crosses the bridge famous in the Goblin story. And just beyond that swells the gray knoll which stands upon a whitewashed church. An opening in the trees now cheered him when he had hoped that a church was bright at hand. The wavering reflection of the silver star at the bosom of the brook told him that he was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring under the lights beyond. He recollected the place where Brom Bones' ghostly competitor had once disappeared. If I can't but reach the bridge, thought Ichabod, I am safe. Just then he heard the black steed panting and bowing close behind him. Another compulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprung upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side, and now Ichabod cast a look behind to see if the pursuers should vanish, according to the rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone. Just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups, in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his cranium with tremendous crash. He was tumbled head first into the dust, and Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse was found within his saddle, and the bridle under his feet. Soberly chopping at grass at his master's gate, Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast. Then dinner, but no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled idly about the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster. Hans Van Ripper now began to feel uneasy about the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. An inquiry was set on foot, and the diligent investigation they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found a saddle, crumpled in the dirt. The tracks of horses' hoofs were deeply dented into the ground, and evidently at furious speed. They were traced to the bridge and beyond. The bank of the broad port of the brook, where the ran deep in the black, and was found that he had unfortunate Ichabod close beside a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the body of the schoolmaster was not recovered. Hans Van Ripper and his executor of his estate examined the bundle, for which retained all his effects. It consisted of 2 shirts and 2 socks, and a pair of 2 of the worst stockings in the old pair you could possibly imagine. As to the books and furniture of the schoolhouse, they belonged to the community, except Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, and a book of dreams and fortune telling, which was last set up on the foldscape. These magic books and the pocket scrawl from was consigned to the flames by Van Ripper, who from that time forward determined to send his children no more to school, observing that they knew some of the same reading and writing. Whatever money their schoolmaster possessed, he had recovered his quaint pay but a day or two before. He must have had about his person at the time of his disappearance. The mysterious event caused speculation at the church on the following Sunday. Knots of glazers and gossipers were first collected at the churchyard at the bridge, and then at the spot where the hat and the pumpkin had been found. The stories of Bower and Bones, the whole budget of others, called to mind, and when they had diligently considered them all, compared with symptoms of the present case, they shook their heads and came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the Hessian. It is true, an old farmer who had been just down from New York on a visit thought the account of ghostly adventure was well received, but had the intelligence that Ichabod Crane was still alive, that he had left the neighborhood partly for fear of the goblin and Hans Van Ripper, and partly in mortification at having suddenly dismissed by the heiress. He had changed his quarters to a distant part of the country, and had kept the school and studied law at the same time. He had admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for newspapers, and finally had been made a justice of the 10-pound court. Bones, too, who shortly went after his rival's disappearance, conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, and observed the look of exceeding knowing that the story of Ichabod was related, and always burst forth a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which had some suspect that he knew more about the matter than he chose. Postscript. The preceding tale is given almost in the precise words of which I heard it related to a corporation meeting of the ancient city of Malhotos, at which were present many of the sagest and most illustrious burghers. The narrator was a pleasant, shabby, gentlemanly old fellow, and has pepper and salt clothes, with a sadly humorous face, and one who I strongly suspect of being poor. When his story was concluded, there was much laughter and approbation, particularly from the two deeply elder statesmen, who had been asleep the greater part of the time. There were, however, one tall, dry-looking old gentleman with bulging eyebrows, who had maintained a grave and rather severe face throughout. Now, folding his arms, he was one of your weary men who never thought to laugh. When the mirth of the rest of the company had subsided and silence was restored, he leaned one arm and elbow onto the chair, sticking the other askew, demanding with slight but exceeding sage mention of the head. What was the moral of the story? What was it meant to prove? The storyteller, who was just putting a glass of water to his lips in refreshment after his toils, paused for a moment, looked at the inquirer with an air of infallibility and indifference, and lowering the glass to the table, observed that the story was intended most logically to prove that there is no situation in life but has its advantages and pleasures, provided that we will take a joke as we find it. That, therefore, he that runs races with goblins troopers are likely to have enough rough time of it. The conscious old gentleman knit his brows tenfold closer after the explanation, being sorely puzzled, while methought the other pepper and salt eyed with him something of a trimming leer. At length he observed that all was very well, but still he thought of the story a little on extravagant. There were extra 2 points for which he had his doubts. Faith, sir, replied the storyteller, as to that matter, I don't believe one half of it myself. Happy Halloween, all. Until next time, I'll catch you on the flip side.